Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this session. I'm very pleased to introduce, again, Christian, who you should be familiar with, but also Ben Grunfeld. Ben is a partner in the energy, sustainability, and infrastructure, um, uh, is a partner of energy, sustainability, and infrastructure at Guidehouse. For those of you who are not familiar with Guidehouse, they are the new brand, as it were, of Navigant. So they're a top 10 energy consultancy. They have about 7,000 consultancies worldwide and advise a whole host of the major utilities across the world. So with that, I'll hand you over to Christian, and he'll take away this session. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Nadim. I'm really pleased to have Benjamin here. We had a little chat already earlier, a few days earlier, and he has really had a great view on the total ecosystem. And I'm looking forward to his presentation, which really shows when is the right timing for hydrogen and what are the factors. And based on that, I encourage everybody to ask your questions, and I hope we'll have a great also Q&A session afterwards. So Benjamin, looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Christian. Much appreciated. I'll start with a really quick thank you to the hosts for the opportunity to speak with you all today. It's a pleasure to be here. I had the privilege of being able to listen into some of the presentations this morning and some of the discussions, and I personally found them very interesting and thought provoking. They've set a high bar, which I'll do my best to match here. So the topic for this session, is really around, the right technology and the right time and scale, right? And is the scale there for this transition, to blue and green hydrogen? And I think it's important to start any discussion about hydrogen and scale, by establishing some perspectives. And so I'll walk through a couple of comparisons. Please don't quote me on the numbers. They're really just intended to be order of magnitude comparisons, but just to kind of provide some background and some context. So when we look at different sources of energy, right? So start with crude oil production. It's about a 4 billion metric ton a year market, with a value of somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion US. Natural gas production is about 160 billion gigajoule a year market, with a value of somewhere in the neighborhood of, kind of half of oil, 650, 700 billion US dollars. Again, you can argue over reference prices and what have you, but sort of ballpark figures. Wind production today, somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 to 150 billion US dollars. Solar electricity today, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 billion US dollars. Hydrogen, existing sources and uses of hydrogen, it's about 70 million metric ton a year industry, with a value of somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 billion US dollars. So today, about the size of, or a little bit more than half the size of wind and solar globally. And so the question is, why start with these comparisons, right? Why are they important? And again, please don't quote me on the numbers, and we can go back and forth on whether I missed a decimal or what have you. But order of magnitude, I think it's important for two reasons. One, it's important to understand, I think, that the existing market for hydrogen as an industrial feedstock is substantial in its own right, right? The production and delivery of gray and black hydrogen today is a meaningful market. It's 100 billion US dollars a year, roughly in terms of turnover, just on the production end. And the second, I think, is that if we think about energy sources, or a new term that in vogue today, energy carriers, hydrogen is actually relatively expensive. And so what that means is it's going to require policy and regulatory support, both direct and indirect, which I'll talk about more. And why do I say it's expensive, right? I mean, if you think about global energy consumption and the mix between coal, crude oil, natural gas, renewables, the total value as a globally that we spend on crude oil and natural gas is really only just over 2 trillion. on the production. And already we spend 200 billion on wind and solar, and we spend 100 billion on hydrogen. So relatively the amount of energy we get as a society, from those different energy sources or carriers, hydrogen is expensive. And so I think that has implications for where it's used and how it's used and where the market is and where the scale comes from. So at Guidehouse, when we think about the necessary conditions for hydrogen to scale, we really think about three factors. The first is reliable, and these are things that are necessary effectively for hydrogen to scale. So the first is that we're going to need reliable and cost competitive sources of production. The second is that we're going to need access. You need access to customers and markets, and that's both physical access, so transportation means, or through pipelines or other means, and commercial access, right, through products and channels to access customers. And then finally, the third is, and I think very importantly, hydrogen, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen will need a stable and supportive policy and regulatory environment. And so I'll look through in the sort of the remaining time. I'm going to look through each of those and talk a bit about each of those different factors. So let's start with reliable and cost competitive production. So the current green hydrogen trends are centered primarily around electrolyzer technology, which is powered by wind and solar. And there's been a lot of conversation already this morning about those different sources. Three technologies of note: alkaline electrolyzers, proton exchange membrane electrolyzers, and solid oxide electrolysis cells. There's a fourth, which is Guidehouse we see capturing some market share based on biomass gasifiers, which is not based on electrolysis, but we don't necessarily see that as being a major competitor to electrolyzers, and expect the electrolyzer technology to largely dominate the green hydrogen landscape. Over the next decade, and I think folks this morning have already talked a bit about this, but we do expect that green hydrogen production will or can become cost competitive with black and gray hydrogen. So that means getting down in the 1 to 2 euros per kilogram price range. And that's in particular when hydrogen production is integrated with the electricity system, and can be used as a way to store undervalued or even unvalued electrons. We're at the stage in the evolution of the technology today where everyone wants to try it themselves in order to prove the concept, and in order to prove as organizations they're capable of delivering value. And there's still a fair bit of work to do on that front. There's a number of demonstration projects in operation and under development with solar PV as the primary feedstock in the Middle East, Australia, and the Iberian Peninsula. Christian highlighted some of these in his presentation earlier that they're involved in. There's also a growing number of onshore and offshore wind to hydrogen demonstration projects that are under development in North America and Central and Western Europe and in Asia. And I think our expectations are that we will get to a point where enough demonstration projects have been completed and enough equipment manufacturers have demonstrated that their technology works, that the market will start to trust the track record, which is what we saw in wind, what we saw in solar PV over the last decade and a half. At that point, manufacturing scale and production scale become incredibly important to achieve cost competitiveness with black and gray hydrogen. And all of that kind of happens in a 5 to 10 to 15 year time horizon. And so this type of large scale hydrogen production is very much resource and location dependent, right? It's likely to be most cost competitive when built close to production sources or close to high levels of wind production or high levels of solar PV production, which is what we're seeing with the location of the current demonstration project. But it may lack some of the benefits of black and gray hydrogen in terms of proximity to demand. So being able to produce close to demand. And this is where the second consideration becomes really important, right? Access to customers and markets. The most likely model that we see going forward for the industry is one where hydrogen is is produced near the source of renewable power and then transported to customers. There are obviously other models, right? You produce renewable power and hydrogen right near the demand, so close to or on site. But it's going to be hard to achieve the same economies of scale that that you can get elsewhere, producing in a more remote location, and that are going to be necessary to be cost competitive, quite frankly. And then other models like transporting the renewable power through the electricity grid and producing hydrogen near the demand source. Again, scale will be a factor in terms of the level of hydrogen offtake that's available. But you also change the decision calculus when you do that, right? Because now for a customer, you can buy green power or you can buy green hydrogen. And so it's a question of the electrification conversion cost versus the hydrogen production conversion cost. And so we expect that market also will be somewhat limited. So coming back to the first model, right, where hydrogen is produced near the abundant and relatively cheap green electricity resource and then transported to demand centers, the transportation options there are somewhat limited. Pipes, ships, trucks, each of which has limitations, and not all are capable necessarily of transporting hydrogen in its raw form. And so we've looked at these options. And again, kind of coming back to the topic, scale and is the timing right and is the technology right? I think, for a recent European, the recent European hydrogen backbone proposal that was published by a number of the gas TSOs in Europe, Guidehouse examined the implications of building a backbone spanning 23,000 kilometers, 75% of which would be made up and of converted natural gas pipelines, and then 25% of which would be new connecting pipeline stretches. We've estimated that would cost somewhere between 25 and 65 billion euros. Yes, a very big range in the grand scheme of things, but even at the top end, considerably less than previous estimates. And when you factor in operational costs and other considerations, it works out to a levelized cost of somewhere between 10 euro cents and 20 euro cents per kilogram of hydrogen transported 1,000 kilometers. So, and the timescales are not that dissimilar to the timescales, for reliable and cost of competitive production, sort of in that, 5 to 10 years to start to establish, 10 to 15 years to really expand and have, be a significant part of in this case, the European energy infrastructure. Given current levels of hydrogen demand, that level of investment, would be hard to justify, which is why we haven't seen, a hydrogen pipeline infrastructure of that kind be built out to support, the current, gray and black hydrogen markets. And so most of that hydrogen production is, transported using other means. However, as I'll talk about next with the right regulatory and policy support, the market potential for hydrogen, could be significantly greater. And so this brings me to the third factor, right? Stable and supportive regulatory and policy environment. Often when we think about supportive policy environments, we think about direct subsidies, right? Or direct purchase support. But in the case of green hydrogen or, and blue hydrogen, that type of support, will ultimately be important, in particular during the early days of the industry's development. Perhaps more important in the case for green hydrogen are the wider environmental and climate policies, and in particular CO2 emission reduction targets. So up to this point, I've been primarily talking about how green hydrogen and blue hydrogen can achieve scale by displacing, through direct substitution, gray and black hydrogen. When you layer in emission reduction targets, internal and external carbon prices, broader environmental policies, we actually change the comparison framework. We change the decision calculus, right? So what under steady state conditions or current state conditions is a comparison between hydrogen produced using competing feedstocks. The comparison under these new and growing and strengthening environmental and climate policies is different, right? So it's green hydrogen for heating, compared to green electrification and energy efficiency, or it's green hydrogen for high temperature industrial heat and feedstocks, compared to major process change or electrification and energy efficiency. green hydrogen for long distance transportation compared to electrification, green hydrogen for long-term energy storage or long-term electron storage, which, quite frankly, if as a region you haven't been endowed with vast hydroelectric resources, there really isn't much of an option, much of a cost-effective alternative to long-term electricity storage, other than maybe expanded interconnections. And those economics are very different, right? And the companies facing those types of decisions, and for companies facing those types of decisions, green hydrogen has, quite different economics. Again, so for Europe, looking at Europe in particular, Guidehouse developed some forecasts through our work with the Gas for Climate Consortium, based on pathways that lead to climate neutrality by the mid-century. And under these scenarios, direct hydrogen consumption in the 4 areas I talked about above, so heating, high temperature industrial heat and feedstocks, long distance transportation, and energy storage, you could see up to an additional 40 to 60 million metric tons by 2050, just in Europe alone, depending on the number of industrial processes that start using hydrogen. So initially the steel and chemical sectors are starting to investigate the use of hydrogen, but recently we've seen other sectors such as glass production start to look into hydrogen as well. And that doesn't even include, the potential within the synthetic jet fuel markets, which could be another 15 to 20 million metric tons for the EU. All that is on top of, so 55 to 80 million metric tons relative to a global demand today of 70 million metric tons. So, tremendous upside potential. Now, the timeframes for this are, potentially a little bit longer, right? Most of the climate targets are, 2030 to 2050. So you're talking, 10 to 20 to 30 years. But certainly, we're seeing signals from the European Commission and others, that are going to look to accelerate that. And so it could be much faster. The global supply, for green hydrogen is essentially, technically limitless, but it is economically and, demand constrained. And none of this indirect substitution takes place without strong climate policies at the national, multinational, but also individual corporate levels. So, to conclude, and I'll wrap up so that I can take questions, what does this all mean? I think for hydrogen consumers, they're facing several difficult internal decisions today, around the choice of hydrogen, or, choosing to invest in hydrogen versus alternative decarbonization options. How do you get over the hydrogen decision stress, right? Green versus blue. Do you produce it yourself? Do you buy it from others? Do you wait or move now? How do you keep your options open? How long can we continue to explore multiple points? There's 2 factors I'd put on the table. One is, I think it's quite likely that in the 10-year time frame, green hydrogen will be competitive against gray and black, right? So you can base decisions, with a reasonable degree of certainty around that. And then I think, when we work with companies on their decarbonization journeys, we're finding that when you start to look at green hydrogen as part of a portfolio and taking into account, innovative financing mechanisms, a strong portfolio design, efficient portfolio and project management, some of these investments can actually be justified sooner. These investments in green and blue hydrogen can be justified sooner. And so hydrogen consumers have more options, have more choice, have the ability to make it through the cloud, if you will, and start to really push the market. On the supplier side, there's a similar set of questions that are facing suppliers, right? What technology do I back? Blue or green? Where in the value chain should I invest? Which customers and markets should I target, and how do I access them? And again, sort of 2 points to conclude there. One, our analysis, and I think this was also confirmed earlier, the biggest value pools are likely to be upstream in the electricity feedstock or in the power to gas production. Roughly about 75% of the total cost likely lives there. But it's not clear to what extent downstream and access to customers will be able to extract more margin, right? Especially in the early days of this market. And the other point is that a lot of hydrogen demand is currently located around industrial clusters. And so if you think about where and where to target and where the opportunities are. We're seeing a lot of activity in that space. So that's a lot, and I've used most of the time. I should have clearly practiced a couple of times before, but I'm happy to take questions.
So Benjamin, thank you so much. It was a tour de force. I mean, you covered the whole ecosystem from the beginning to the end. I see several questions coming in, but let me start with a quick one from my side. You mentioned the growth and the additional volume coming for all the opportunities. Will green hydrogen become a commodity, a traded commodity with a transparent price on the market? What do you think?
Great question. And I think, I have a personal view. I think there's a context within which to look at this, and that is the sort of the current diversity in energy markets that we have today, right? So on the one hand, you have a truly global market for oil, right? Almost single reference price, highly transportable, highly tradable liquid commodity. On the other hand, you have electricity, right, which is a much more regionalized product, very different regional reference prices, limited ability to transport, over long distances. And you have natural gas in the middle, right, which is a combination of regional markets, small volumes that are transported globally, through LNG and other mechanisms. And I think hydrogen's heading sort of more towards that natural gas model, I would suspect, than to a sort of pure, true kind of oil model where there's a single price and, truly global commodity. But I think, what we're seeing is that there is opportunity to transport, and certainly some volume of green hydrogen that's produced could find its way onto ships and onto, trucks and create some global liquidity, to supplement what I suspect would be a pretty heavily regional market setup.
Great, absolutely. I think this helps a lot to grab a bit where the journey is going. Let me jump into one question here. The available technologies for green hydrogen production for onboard applications, trains, ship, in order not to have so big storages of today application that does not have onboard production. Is it something you want
Sorry,
to take?
say that again, Christian. Sorry.
Which are the available technologies for green hydrogen production for onboard applications such as trains and ships, in order not to have so big storage as today applications that does not have onboard production? Yeah,
so you have to think about further hydrogen processing, right? I mean, I think we look at hydrogen sort of transport and storage as ammonia or other mechanisms. I think there isn't we have or high levels of compression. I think there's there hasn't necessarily emerged a strong technology or hydrogen production technology that is easily results in a hydrogen in a form that's easily transportable. There's sort of additional processing that's required.
Yeah. There's another question. Actually, it's on a bit of Portuguese Dutch. I'm also happy to take that one in case. A Portuguese newspaper writes today that EU failed Dutch strategy as the government will use coal and natural gas to produce hydrogen in the transition phase. Are you aware of this? What is your opinion? Shall I go for that one?
Sure. Yeah, happy to.
well, in general, there is a transition phase, and it's sure that the off-taking, the whole ecosystem needs to be built up. There are two main approaches for the Dutch strategy. The one is, that will produce over time, especially on the wind side, their own green hydrogen. Yeah. And this is upcoming and in planning, but it will take a bit of time. And the second, there is a nice cooperation between Portugal and the Dutch government, where the so-called Sinch project is kind of set up to do import and export of green hydrogen to Netherlands. But once it's there, the ecosystem needs to be running, and this can be done with hydrogen as it is today. We need to know all hydrogen produced today is kind of produced that way. So it's not a bad news. We're just changing over time to green hydrogen production.
Yeah. The other point I'd add to that, Christian, is the Netherlands is obviously one of the regions where there's a lot of investment and focus at the moment around CCUS. linked to both just industrial processes, but also hydrogen production. There's a number of, large projects, associated with the Port of Rotterdam or the Port of, Amsterdam that are looking at CCUS as a, mechanism for, reducing the carbon intensity of hydrogen production in industrial processes. I haven't seen the Portuguese newspaper article, but that may be an element to factor in.
Yeah. Another question is there greater value in producing hydrogen near a customer or on-site by a customer? Is producing hydrogen easy, like for forklifts, so it is going to cut out the middleman utility role?
I think that the big question there will be scale and reliability. And recognizing that, if you're going to source, produce that hydrogen using green power, right, then, that green power has to be produced and transported to the customer, right? So it's, it's in some respects, it's a bit of a simple, cost benefit, right? Do you produce close to where the power's produced? You produce hydrogen close to where the power's produced and then transport to customers, and you get, a cost and reliability, and implication from that, relative to, producing power, transporting it through the electrical infrastructure to the customer and creating the hydrogen there. And obviously there's operational, considerations, but if you think about, the way that some industrial gases are produced today, there's certainly a model for, on-site or near-site production of industrial feedstocks. I think there's a growing number of demonstration projects that are trying to just, answer and address the challenge and the question around how hard is it to actually make green hydrogen, right? What are some of the complications around, keeping the electrolyzers up and running, maintaining reliability? What happens if you have variable power input versus steady and static power input? So there's still a fair bit of, R&D and demonstration work to do around that. But I think the answer to that question will ultimately come down, to economics, right? Is it more cost effective to produce hydrogen in bulk and transport, or, produce electricity in bulk and produce hydrogen, in smaller scale? And I suspect there'll be a mix, right? There won't, we won't just see one model. There'll always be instances where one makes economic sense and the other doesn't. But I think, that which way the industry is headed, at least today, I suspect it's, looks most, if you took a survey, if we took a poll of this group, I think most people would assume larger scale production, tends to dominate, but that could certainly change, as we've seen in solar, right? Or as we've seen in some other, renewable and distributed electricity resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also depending on the off-taking model and the economics, both models will exist. There's also a technology topic like a solid oxide topic, which the heat is a topic to exchange and make it more efficient. And this could be maybe in the next 5 to 10 years something upcoming and changing a bit also the landscape. There's questions coming in one after the other. Let me just try to catch as much as possible with you. It's a great pleasure to discuss it with you. So in order to, and the next one, I like very much the question, in order to achieve a consistently scalable hydrogen economy, we need to assume that hydrogen supply generally matches the demand. Do you foresee a situation where hydrogen demand could suddenly outstrip hydrogen supply? For example, introduction of a new law causing whole industries to fight over supplies of green hydrogen.
I think that would be a nice situation in some respects. I think, my sense is, supply will continue to outstrip demand. In the sense, like we've seen in renewable power, right? There's more projects under development, more capital flowing into the sector, than current demand. Although, in theory, the demand could potentially be much higher. I think there certainly is, an opportunity, or there certainly is the potential, as we've talked about, for a timing mismatch, right? So where, policies accelerate demand growth faster than the technology or, developers are able to, put hydrogen production into service. I think over the long term, right, there's likely to be more potential to increase supply, but certainly some timing differential could exist, and you could see a period in this transition in particular where demand growth increases substantially, and it takes time for the demonstration projects to finish, for manufacturing scale to emerge, for for projects in production to ramp up.
Very good. I see that we have a little more time to go until 1 p.m. CET, so we can take some more questions, which is great. There is a question from Benoit, who asked, will H2 actually be injected in the existing pipeline to reach overall 20% hydrogen concentration? And on the power to gas, is repowering a real alternative for the demand side?
So, I think there's certainly discussion about, what's the right level for blending in the current, natural gas and methane pipelines. The numbers that I've heard and seen talked about, sort of talking a bit more about like 10%, as a sort of an upper limit, potentially for blending, maybe not, technically, but sort of commercially as well. The challenge obviously becomes, what are the impacts on the actual concentration within different elements of the pipe, right? It isn't, the molecules are different. It's not like a green electron and a, electron produced from coal. At the end of the day, the electrons are the same. Obviously, when you blend, hydrogen molecules with methane molecules, you alter the composition of the actual, gas in the pipe. And so, there's some implications from that. But I do think, and there's been some discussion certainly at the European level around, a blending requirement. Again, ethanol in gasoline, or, some of the RPS early renewable portfolio standards in that part of the sector. I think it's an interesting and certainly a really potentially a strong way to boost early stage demand for green hydrogen, and can certainly help to, as I think, Christian, you're probably finding with some of your projects as well, the offtake part of this is certainly an open question, right? Who's buying? What prices are they willing to pay? Something like a blending target, is a way to at least get over that in the short term.
Yeah. Heading maybe to both questions before, or one comment on my side on the demand side, I see already kind of a bit of a shortage of a reliable supply in a certain time, because there is a longer time change of technology in the mobility, or even if you think of burners and other things, at which time is a reliable supply of real green hydrogen there. And there is right now a lack of, committed green hydrogen. So right now it's a bit of a mixture of the both. I mean, we're working a lot of developing the green hydrogen supply. On the other hand, there is a demand developing, which is a bit hindered by the confirmed supply. So it's both sides are right now a bit in a lack of, let's say, and it can even develop further in this direction. I could imagine. Yeah. And on the gas blending, in fact, one thing which could happen is that up to a certain point of blending, the infrastructure cost investments are not so high, but at some point maybe really this kind of 100% grids could be something which then start locally, where then you really make a shift rather than gradually going 20, 40, 60, 80%. Maybe there's a step sometime.
Yeah, especially if there's a premium for, if there's a premium today for green hydrogen, it's hard to extract that premium, if you're effectively just selling a blended commodity in the same way. So there's some challenges there.
Yeah. And just mentioning, I'm the only country I'm aware of, and luckily we are doing project there, is Portugal, who put this as a possibility to, kick off the offtake volume from the start. There is a certain level of flexibility then, which allows to develop the other demand side gradually, which will happen.
Yeah.
So there's a question, I think you mentioned, you covered it partly already. How do you see methanol in this context? I think if you want to elaborate further on it.
Yeah, so certainly biomethane and is part of the overall, I think, green molecule story. Again, you get to are there are there opportunities to compete at scale, right, with other with traditional sources. And I think the other challenge is you sort of have to start to look from a, as I mentioned sort of towards the end of my remarks, that, you really have to start to look from a consumer perspective, right? Customers are ultimately, the large industrials or other customers are going to start to look at all of their options and are looking at all of their options when it comes to decarbonizing or reducing the carbon emissions intensity of their businesses and cities and regions. And all these things compete, right? Quite frankly, right? Green electricity competes with green and blue hydrogen, competes with biomethane, competes with energy efficiency, competes with all the possible pathways that are out there, measures that are out there. And I think right now, green power and green and blue hydrogen seem to be dominating, that conversation. But I fully expect that there'll be other options that come into the fray as well over time.
Absolutely. And let's go for maybe the last question. Let's see. Do you foresee the development of a hydrogen GEOs in the short term? If not, how to demonstrate you are producing green hydrogen, especially in an off-site configuration, electrolyzer feed by the grid?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different initiatives already in play around sort of verifying and validating through certificates or other mechanisms that the hydrogen was produced using green power or was produced in such a way that the emissions zero emission or net zero emissions. I think that'll be important. I do think there'll be, like we have seen emerge in, again, the renewable power space, right? That there will be the need to be able to validate and demonstrate, that the hydrogen is what it says it is. And it's no different than a label on a piece of clothing, right? That sort of says where it's made. I think that they'll be essential. For the transparency, for the financing aspect, for the sort of policy measurement and tracking that things like that emerge. So yeah, absolutely, I think it'll be important.
Yeah, maybe a closing comment on that one from my side. Luckily, the hydrogen doesn't smell or you cannot touch it. At Smart Energy, by the way, we gave it a sound, but it's another story for another conference. But I should file a patent to make green hydrogen really green, like the oil, the truck diesel. You have a color, or the heating diesel. Different, so putting really the color in the gas would be something nice to file, but we haven't invented yet, I think.
Yeah, it's like the smell in natural gas. Yeah.
Anyway, Benjamin, it was great to chat with you and to be in touch with the audience with your questions. Thank you very much for all of you out there. And I'm looking forward to continue the discussion with Benjamin and all the others here, also in the networking which we have. Have a good continuation. It's lunch break, I believe, right now, so grab a sandwich. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for joining and the questions.
Nadim
Appreciate
is coming online again also, Nadim.
Thanks. Bye-bye.